Tigris River runs red with blood for 3 days straight. Then it turns black. Not from more blood, but from ink. Millions of books from the greatest library in the world are being thrown into the water. Ancient Greek texts that survived nowhere else. Persian medical treatises, mathematical proofs that won't be rediscovered for centuries. Scientific instruments, astronomical charts, all of it being hurled into the river by Mongol soldiers who can't read a single word. This isn't a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. This is Baghdad in February 1258, and the soldiers destroying 500 years of human knowledge aren't mindless barbarians. They're following orders, systematic orders, professional orders, because the Mongols didn't sack cities by accident. They did it with the efficiency of an industrial machine. In 13 days, the Mongol army would kill somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people. They would destroy the House of Wisdom, the intellectual center of the medieval world. They would execute the last Abbasid caliph by rolling him in a carpet and trampling him with horses, so that his royal blood wouldn't touch the ground. And they would end the Islamic Golden Age so completely that the Middle East would take centuries to recover. This is the story of how the greatest city in the world became a graveyard in less than 2 weeks. Before diving into this forgotten catastrophe that changed world history, if you enjoy learning about the pivotal moments that shaped our civilization and the brutal truths that textbooks leave out, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Now, we need to stop and correct a massive misconception that dominates Western understanding of this event. The popular narrative says something like this: the Islamic Golden Age was already declining. Baghdad was a shadow of its former glory, and the Mongols simply finished off a dying civilization. This is complete nonsense, and it's dangerous nonsense because it erases one of the greatest crimes in human history. Let me be crystal clear about what Baghdad was in 1258. This wasn't some fading backwater clinging to past glories. This was a city of 1 million people when London had maybe 80,000. It was the intellectual capital of the world. The House of Wisdom contained more books than existed in all of Western Europe combined. The city had public hospitals with specialized departments, running water systems, street lights, public libraries, universities that taught medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy to students from 3 continents, while European nobles were wiping their asses with their hands and dying of infections from minor cuts. Baghdad had hospitals performing cataract surgery with anesthesia, while European scholars were debating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Baghdad's astronomers were calculating the Earth's circumference to within a few miles of the correct answer, while European cities dumped sewage into the streets. Baghdad had a sanitation system that wouldn't be matched in the West for another 400 years. Was the Abbasid Caliphate as militarily dominant as it had been in the 8th century? No. Had political fragmentation weakened central authority? Yes. But the idea that Baghdad was somehow ready to fall is revisionist garbage invented to make the Mongol conquest seem like historical inevitability, rather than what it actually was: the deliberate annihilation of the world's most advanced civilization. The man who ruled this city was Caliph al-Mustasim. History has not been kind to him. Most accounts paint him as a weak, pleasure-loving fool who ignored the Mongol threat until it was too late. And you know what? That's mostly accurate. But we need to understand why he was unprepared, because it reveals something important about how civilizations die. Al-Mustasim wasn't stupid. He was trapped. The Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 was nothing like the empire that had ruled from Spain to Central Asia 5 centuries earlier. By al-Mustasim's time, the caliph's actual political power extended maybe 50 miles outside Baghdad's walls. He was a religious figurehead, a symbol. The Islamic world had fractured into dozens of competing sultanates, emirates, and khanates, all theoretically acknowledging the caliph's spiritual authority while ignoring his political commands. So when Hulagu Khan's army started moving west from Persia in 1256, al-Mustasim couldn't just summon the armies of Islam to defend Baghdad. Those armies belonged to rulers who had their own problems. The Mamluks in Egypt were watching nervously, but staying put. The Seljuks in Anatolia had already been vassalized. The various petty emirs and sultans were calculating whether submitting to the Mongols might be safer than fighting them. Al-Mustasim sent letters. Lots of letters, begging for help, offering alliances, promising gold. The responses ranged from sympathetic but useless to openly hostile. One sultan reportedly wrote back suggesting that maybe if the caliph had spent less time collecting books and more time building armies, he wouldn't be in this situation. The Islamic world was going to watch Baghdad burn. Together, while doing nothing. The caliph's chief advisor was a Shia Muslim named Ibn al-Khami. Remember that name. It becomes important later. Al-Khami allegedly assured the caliph that the Mongols could be negotiated with, that Hulagu was a reasonable man, that if Baghdad submitted peacefully and paid tribute, the city would be spared. Some historians claim Al-Khami was secretly in contact with the Mongols. Others say he was just naive. Either way, he gave the caliph exactly the advice that guaranteed disaster. Now let me tell you about Hulagu Khan. This wasn't Genghis Khan, the terrifying founder of the Mongol Empire. This was his grandson, and Hulagu was something arguably more dangerous than his grandfather. A true believer in Mongol exceptionalism with the resources of the largest empire in human history behind him. Genghis Khan conquered because he was brilliant, brutal, and pragmatic. He destroyed cities when necessary but preferred submission and tribute. His empire was built on terror as a tool, not an ideology. Hulagu inherited the terror tactics, but added religious mission. His wife was a Nestorian Christian. His chief general, Kitbuk, was a Nestorian Christian. His astrologers told him the stars favored his campaign. He saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as an agent of cosmic justice, sent to punish the Muslim world for centuries of dominance. He was also meticulous. When Hulagu began his march on Baghdad, he didn't rush. He spent months positioning his forces. He secured supply lines. He brought Chinese siege engineers with their explosive powder weapons and counterweight trebuchet. He recruited local auxiliaries who knew the terrain. He gathered intelligence on Baghdad's defenses, its food supplies, its political factions. By the time his army arrived at Baghdad's walls in January 1258, he knew more about the city's weaknesses than the caliph did. The Mongol army that surrounded Baghdad numbered somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 men. Not all of them were ethnic Mongols. Hulagu commanded Mongol cavalry, obviously, but also Turkish horse archers, Persian infantry, Armenian and Georgian Christians, who saw this as a holy war against Islam, and even some Arab tribes who decided betting on the Mongols was safer than loyalty to Baghdad. This multi-ethnic composition wasn't a weakness. It was deliberate strategy. The Mongols had perfected a system of imperial warfare that absorbed conquered peoples into their military machine. Chinese engineers brought siege technology. Persian bureaucrats managed logistics. Turkish auxiliaries, who knew the region, provided intelligence. It was military organization on a scale Europe wouldn't achieve for another 4 centuries. The logistics alone are staggering. Moving 150,000 men across Persia required a supply chain that could provide food, water, fodder for tens of thousands of horses, replacement weapons, medical supplies, and siege equipment. The Mongols had specialized units just for supply management. They requisitioned from conquered territories, but they also carried portable siege equipment that could be assembled on site. The counterweight trebuchets weren't dragged across the desert, fully assembled. They were transported as components and built by Chinese engineers when they reached the target. Hulagu also brought something psychological, a reputation. By 1258, the Mongols had been conquering cities for 50 years. Everyone knew what happened to cities that resisted. Everyone had heard the stories. The name Mongol carried the same terror in the 13th century that nuclear weapon carries today. It was a threat that transcended normal military calculation. The city's defenses were formidable, or at least they looked formidable. Baghdad was surrounded by thick brick walls with towers and gates. The Tigris River provided water and a supply route. The caliph could field maybe 50,000 soldiers, including his personal guard, city militia, and various contingents from nearby territories, but numbers don't tell the whole story. Baghdad's 50,000 defenders included professional soldiers, yes, but also hastily armed civilians, merchants pressed into service, religious volunteers with more faith than training. They had siege weapons on the walls, but most were older designs. They had armor and weapons, but much of it was ornamental, meant for parades and ceremonies rather than actual combat. The caliphate hadn't fought a major war in decades. The soldiers had no recent combat experience. The commanders had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. On paper, this should have been a brutal, grinding siege that might take years. Baghdad's walls had never been breached by a foreign army. The city had endured sieges before. It had vast granaries that could feed the population for months. In a straight fight, defending a fortified city against even a larger army, Baghdad should have had a chance, but Hulagu wasn't offering a straight fight. In late January 1258, Hulagu sent an envoy to the caliph with a letter. The letter was polite, almost friendly. It acknowledged the caliph's religious authority. It praised Baghdad's beauty and learning. And then it made a simple demand. Submit completely, open the gates, dismantle the fortifications, send tribute, acknowledge Mongol supremacy, or else. Al-Mustasim's response has been debated by historians for centuries. Some sources say he sent back a defiant letter, reminding Hulagu that Baghdad was the center of the Muslim world, and that any attack would unite all of Islam against the Mongols. Other sources say he tried to negotiate, offering tribute, but refusing to dismantle the walls. Still others claim he simply ignored the ultimatum, convinced that help was coming from Egypt, or that the Mongols would withdraw when they realized the difficulty of taking the city. What we know for certain is that the caliph did not surrender, and that was the end of Baghdad. Hulagu's engineers began their work on January 29, 1258. They didn't start with a direct assault on the walls. That would be stupid. Instead, they did something brilliant and terrifying. They broke the dams. Baghdad sits between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, with a complex system of irrigation canals, dams and water management systems that had been refined over centuries. The Mongols identified the critical dam north of the city, captured it with a lightning cavalry raid, and destroyed it. Millions of gallons of water flooded the plain east of Baghdad, turning it into a swamp. Why does this matter? Because it meant the caliph's cavalry was now useless. You can't charge horses through a flooded plain. The Mongol horse archers, meanwhile, were perfectly happy to sit on higher ground and shoot arrows at defenders who couldn't effectively retaliate. In one move, Hulagu had neutralized Baghdad's main offensive capability and turned a portion of the city's defenses into a soggy death trap. Then came the artillery. The Chinese siege engineers set up their counterweight trebuchets and began bombarding the walls. These weren't the primitive traction trebuchets used in earlier medieval warfare. These were sophisticated machines that could hurl 300-pound stones with terrifying accuracy. They also launched explosive devices, primitive grenades filled with gunpowder and shrapnel that would explode on impact. The bombardment went on for days. Brick walls that had stood for centuries began to crack. Towers collapsed. The defenders tried to respond with their own siege weapons, but they were outmatched. The Mongol engineers had positioned their trebuchets at the maximum range of Baghdad's weapons, while remaining well within their own superior range. It was systematic, professional, overwhelming. On February 5th, after a week of bombardment, the Mongols launched their first major assault, not on the walls. On the eastern gate, the one facing the flooded plain where the caliph's cavalry couldn't maneuver. Mongol infantry, protected by portable siege shields, advanced through the water and swarmed the gate, under covering fire from thousands of archers. The siege shields were ingenious pieces of engineering. Wooden frames covered with wet hides to resist fire arrows, tall enough for multiple soldiers to shelter behind, mounted on wheels so they could be pushed forward as the assault progressed. The Mongols would advance in waves, each wave covering the next, maintaining constant pressure on the defenders while minimizing their own casualties. The defenders responded with everything they had. Archers on the walls rained arrows down on the advancing Mongols. Others poured boiling oil and pitch from the ramparts. Stones and debris were hurled from the towers, but the Mongol archers were firing back, and they were better trained. They weren't aiming randomly. They were targeting specific defenders. Archers exposing themselves to shoot, officers directing the defense, anyone operating the defensive siege weapons. The fighting was brutal. The defenders knew this was it. If the gate fell, the city was doomed. They fought with everything they had: boiling oil, arrows, rocks, desperate sorties where defenders would rush out from the gate to try to destroy the siege equipment, only to be cut down by Mongol cavalry waiting in ambush. The bodies piled up so high at the gate that attackers were climbing over corpses to reach the walls. But the Mongols kept coming, wave after wave. They didn't care about casualties. They had the numbers, they had the momentum, and they had done this 100 times before in 100 other cities. The assault wasn't just at the gate. While the main attack focused there, Mongol engineers were undermining the walls in other sections. They would dig tunnels under the foundations, shore them up with wooden supports, then fill the tunnels with combustible materials and set them on fire. The supports would burn through, the tunnel would collapse, and the wall above would crack and sometimes fall. It was slow, dangerous work, but it was effective. For 5 days, the fighting at the Eastern Gate continued. 5 days of constant assault, constant casualties, constant pressure. The defenders rotated shifts to avoid exhaustion, but they were getting worn down. Food was running low. Wounded soldiers filled the streets. Morale was cracking. Then, on February 10th, the defenders made a critical mistake, or maybe they had no choice. Sources disagree. Some say a section of wall near the gate collapsed from sustained bombardment. Others say a Mongol mine successfully brought down a tower. Still others claim treachery, that someone inside opened a sally port and let Mongol infiltrators in. Whatever the cause, the Eastern Gate fell on February 10th, and Mongol soldiers poured into Baghdad. Imagine you're a civilian in Baghdad when news spreads that the gate has fallen. You've been hearing the bombardment for almost 2 weeks. You've watched the smoke rise from burning buildings hit by explosive projectiles. You've seen wounded soldiers carried through the streets. You've heard the rumors about what the Mongols do to cities that resist, and now the gate is open. Some people tried to flee to the western side of the city, hoping to escape across the Tigris. Others barricaded themselves in their homes. The wealthier families bribed officials for spots in boats heading downriver. The soldiers, what was left of them, retreated to defensive positions in the city center, preparing for street-to-street fighting. Al-Mustasim, still inside his palace, finally understood that negotiation was no longer an option. He sent out his son and several viziers to negotiate a surrender. Maybe, he hoped, if he surrendered now, the city would be spared total destruction. Hulagu received the delegation. He was polite. He served them tea, and he told them to go back and tell the caliph to come out himself, personally, to surrender. In person. On February 13, 1258, Caliph al-Mustasim, the 37th Abbasid Caliph, spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, descended from the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, walked out of his palace and surrendered to Hulagu Khan. Hulagu kept him alive, for now. Then, the Mongols entered the city. What happened next was not chaotic. It was systematic. Hulagu didn't just turn his army loose to rape and pillage randomly. He gave orders, specific orders. The Mongol army would be divided into groups. Each group would be assigned a district. They would go door to door. They would kill everyone except artisans and craftsmen who would be enslaved and sent back to Mongolia. They would collect all valuables in designated assembly points. They would burn everything else. The slaughter began on February 13th and continued for a week. Contemporary sources, both Muslim and Christian, describe streets piled with corpses so high that horses couldn't pass. The Tigris River ran red with blood for days. Then it turned black with ink as Mongol soldiers, following orders to destroy everything related to Islamic governance and scholarship, threw the contents of Baghdad's libraries into the water. The House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the medieval world, was systematically emptied. Books that had survived nowhere else: Greek philosophical texts, Persian poetry, Arabic scientific treatises, mathematical texts from India, astronomical observations going back centuries. The Mongols couldn't read any of it. They didn't care. Orders were orders. Into the river it went. A Persian historian named Juvaini, who witnessed the aftermath, wrote that the waters of the Tigris ran black for 6 months. That's probably an exaggeration, but it tells you how much knowledge was destroyed. The ink from millions of manuscripts literally polluted the river. Modern historians debate the death toll. Conservative estimates say 200,000 people died. Higher estimates go up to 800,000. or even a million. We'll never know the real number. What we know is that Baghdad, a city of roughly 1 million people before the siege, had maybe a few thousand survivors when the Mongols finally left. Let me be very specific about how people died, because the details matter. This wasn't just random violence. The Mongols were implementing a policy called harrowing that they had perfected across dozens of cities. They would gather civilians in open spaces, then systematically execute them in ways designed to maximize terror while minimizing Mongol casualties. Groups of civilians would be forced to kneel. Then Mongol soldiers would walk down the lines, beheading people one by one. This could take hours, days. The psychological torture of watching hundreds of people die before it's your turn was part of the strategy. It broke resistance. It ensured compliance. Children were killed in front of parents, wives in front of husbands. The Mongols didn't do this because they were sadistic savages who enjoyed cruelty. They did it because Genghis Khan's military doctrine, which Hulagu followed religiously, taught that terror was the most effective weapon. Cities that resisted were obliterated so completely that the next city would surrender without a fight. It was calculated, cold, efficient. Scholars were specifically targeted. Anyone identified as educated, anyone who could read and write beyond basic literacy, was killed or enslaved. The Mongols saw the Islamic scholarly class as the source of resistance ideology. Destroy the scholars, destroy the ability to organize resistance. It was strategic decapitation of an entire civilization's intellectual infrastructure. The Christian populations of Baghdad were largely spared. Hulagu's wife, Dako's Khatun, interceded on behalf of the Nestorian Christians, and Hulagu honored her request. This created one of history's darkest ironies: churches protected, while mosques burned. Christians stepped over the bodies of their Muslim neighbors, grateful to be alive, wondering if this was divine judgment or just the random cruelty of conquest. And what about Caliph al-Mustasim? Hulagu kept him alive for several days after the city fell. Some sources say Hulagu forced the caliph to watch the destruction, to see his city burn, to witness the murder of his people, to understand completely what his refusal to surrender had cost. Then came the question of execution. Mongol law prohibited spilling royal blood on the ground. It was seen as offensive to the earth, so they got creative. The most widely reported account says they wrapped al-Mustasim in a carpet and had horses trample him to death. His blood soaked into the carpet, not the ground. Problem solved. Other sources describe different methods. Some say he was kicked to death. Others claim he was simply executed in private, and the carpet story was invented to add insult to the humiliation. We'll never know exactly how he died. What matters is that the last Abbasid caliph in Baghdad was murdered like a common criminal, and with him died any pretense that the caliphate still held real power. His sons were executed too. The entire Abbasid family in Baghdad was wiped out. A few relatives escaped and eventually made it to Cairo, where the Mamluks installed a puppet Abbasid caliph to give their regime religious legitimacy. But that was a hollow shadow. The real caliphate died in Baghdad in February 1258. When the killing finally stopped, Hulagu toured the ruined city. Contemporary accounts say he rode through streets filled with corpses and showed no emotion. He had done this before. He would do it again. This was just another city. Another conquest. Another example for anyone who dared resist Mongol authority. The siege had lasted 13 days from the first assault to the fall of the Eastern Gate. The slaughter lasted a week. In less than 3 weeks, Baghdad had been transformed from the intellectual capital of the world to a charnel house. But here's what makes this story even darker. It gets worse. Because the destruction of Baghdad wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a civilizational collapse that would reshape the Middle East for centuries. The Abbasid Caliphate had been the glue holding Islamic civilization together for 500 years. It wasn't just political authority, it was cultural continuity. Scholarly networks, trade routes, legal systems, shared language. When Baghdad fell, that entire interconnected system began to fragment. Scholars scattered to Egypt, North Africa, Andalusia, India, but they were refugees, not members of a thriving intellectual community. Libraries that had taken centuries to build were gone. Scientific instruments were destroyed. Astronomical observations lost. Medical knowledge forgotten. Entire fields of study simply disappeared because the books and the teachers who could explain them were dead. The irrigation systems that had supported agriculture in Iraq for millennia were deliberately destroyed by the Mongols and never properly rebuilt. The region went from breadbasket to backwater. Population declined. Cities shrank. Trade routes shifted. The center of Islamic civilization moved west to Cairo and eventually Istanbul. Iraq would not recover to pre-Mongol population levels until the 20th century. 700 years. Let's talk about what was actually lost, because the numbers are staggering. The House of Wisdom alone contained an estimated 400,000 manuscripts. To put that in context, the entire Library of Alexandria, at its peak, might have held 500,000 scrolls. Baghdad's collection rivaled or exceeded it, and it was all destroyed in a week. Original works by al-Khwarizmi, the mathematician who gave us algebra, lost. Treatises on optics that wouldn't be matched in Europe for 400 years, lost. Medical texts describing surgical procedures that European physicians wouldn't rediscover until the Renaissance, lost. Astronomical tables more accurate than anything available in Christian Europe, lost. Let me be specific about what this meant. Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra survived only because copies had been sent to Spain decades earlier. His astronomical tables, which were more accurate than any European calculations at the time, survived in fragments, but his complete corpus? Gone. Ibn al-Haytham's revolutionary work on optics, which laid the groundwork for the scientific method itself, survived only because it had been copied in Cairo. The Baghdad manuscripts, destroyed. The House of Wisdom wasn't just a library, it was a working research institution. Think of it as a combination of the Library of Congress, MIT, and the National Institutes of Health, all in one building. Scholars didn't just store books there. They worked there. They translated ancient Greek and Persian texts into Arabic. They conducted astronomical observations from the attached observatory. They performed medical research, mathematical calculations, philosophical debates. When the Mongols destroyed the House of Wisdom, they weren't just burning books, they were killing ongoing research projects, astronomical observations that had been recorded nightly for decades, creating star charts of unprecedented accuracy, lost. Medical case studies documenting treatments and outcomes, lost. Translations of Greek philosophical texts that existed nowhere else, lost. The scholars who understood those texts and could teach them, dead. Consider the mathematics. Baghdad in 1258 had mathematicians working on concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the 16th or 17th century. Algebra, obviously. Trigonometry. Early concepts of calculus. Algorithms, literally named after al-Khwarizmi. The concept of zero as a number rather than just a placeholder. Imported from India and refined in Baghdad. All of this was documented in manuscripts that were methodically destroyed. The astronomical knowledge was even more advanced. Baghdad's astronomers had calculated the Earth's circumference to within a few miles of the correct measurement. They had detailed observations of lunar eclipses going back 200 years. They had star catalogues more complete than anything available in Christian Europe. They had mathematical models of planetary motion that, while not perfect, were more sophisticated than European models wouldn't develop for centuries. Medical knowledge. Baghdad's hospitals were teaching surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparation, and diagnostic methods that European medicine wouldn't achieve until after the Renaissance. They had specialized departments for different conditions. They kept records of treatments and outcomes to evaluate effectiveness. This was empirical medicine, based on observation and documentation, not just theory and tradition. Some knowledge survived because it had been copied and sent to other cities. Some texts were rediscovered centuries later in libraries, in Spain, or Persia, or Central Asia, but massive amounts of human knowledge simply vanished. Ideas that might have advanced science or medicine or mathematics by centuries were erased. We'll never know what we lost, because we don't know what we don't know. There's archaeological evidence too. Modern excavations in Baghdad have found layers of ash and destruction from February 1258. They found mass graves. They found burned buildings that match contemporary descriptions of the House of Wisdom's location. They found fragments, just fragments of manuscripts buried in the rubble, charred pieces of parchment with Arabic text. mathematical diagrams, astronomical charts, pieces of a civilization preserved only as archaeological curiosities. There's a concept in military history called a civilizational beheading. It's when you don't just conquer a people, but destroy the institutional knowledge that makes their civilization function. The Mongols did this to Baghdad with cold precision. They didn't just kill people. They killed the idea of Baghdad as a center of learning and progress. And here's where we need to address the moral complexity that makes this story so uncomfortable. Because while the destruction of Baghdad was unquestionably catastrophic, we can't pretend the Islamic world was some peaceful utopia before the Mongols arrived. The Abbasid Caliphate had been built on conquest too. Muslim armies had swept across Christian North Africa, Zoroastrian Persia, and Buddhist Central Asia, with their own campaigns of conversion by the sword. The difference was scale and permanence. Muslim conquerors generally followed a pattern: conquer, convert, assimilate, build. They destroyed temples but built mosques. They displaced local elites but created new administrative systems. They were empire builders, which meant they needed functioning societies to rule and tax. The Mongols in 1258 Baghdad weren't empire building. They were making an example. Hulagu did eventually establish the Ilkhanate, a Mongol state in Persia that would rule for nearly a century and even convert to Islam. But that came later, in 1258. In Baghdad, the goal was terror, not governance. We also can't ignore that some Muslims welcomed the Mongol invasion. The Shia Muslims, who had been marginalized under Sunni Abbasid rule, saw the Mongols as potential liberators. Some collaborated. Some provided intelligence. Ibn al-Alqami, the vizier we mentioned earlier, is accused by Sunni sources of deliberately weakening Baghdad's defenses and encouraging the caliph to surrender. Whether that's true or Sunni propaganda trying to blame the defeat on Shia treachery rather than military incompetence, we'll never know for certain. The Christian communities that were spared certainly didn't mourn the caliphate's fall. The Armenian historians who chronicled the siege wrote with barely concealed satisfaction about God's judgment on the Muslims. Hulagu's Christian wife became a symbol of hope for Eastern Christians who had lived under Muslim rule for 6 centuries. The idea that Christian Mongols might liberate Jerusalem was intoxicating. It never happened, but the dream persisted. This is the messy reality of 1258. It wasn't a simple story of barbarians destroying civilization. It was a multi-religious, multi-ethnic army destroying a multi-religious, multi-ethnic city on the orders of a multi-religious command structure pursuing a ruthlessly pragmatic imperial policy that happened to align with some groups' religious and political interests while annihilating others. Fast forward to today. Walk through Baghdad. You'll find almost nothing from before 1258. The House of Wisdom is gone. The great mosques that survived the siege were destroyed in later conflicts. The palaces are ruins. The libraries are empty. The intellectual tradition that made Baghdad the Paris of the medieval world exists now only in fragments, scattered across a dozen countries. Modern Baghdad is built on top of the ruins of medieval Baghdad. Archaeologists excavating the old city have to dig through layers of destruction. Ottoman construction, then earlier rebuilding attempts, then the ash and rubble layer from 1258. That ash layer is everywhere. It's a geological marker of catastrophe, like the iridium layer marking the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. The psychological trauma lingers too. The Mongol conquest entered Islamic consciousness as a catastrophe on par with the Crusades, a reminder that military weakness invites destruction. The failure of the Islamic world to unite against the Mongol threat became a cautionary tale about the dangers of political fragmentation. Sermons in mosques still reference the fall of Baghdad as an example of what happens when Muslims abandon unity and scholarly pursuit for political squabbling and worldly pleasures. There's a specific Arabic term, Minat Baghdad. The ordeal of Baghdad. It's used to describe any overwhelming catastrophe, any destruction that seems to signal the end of an era. When extremists destroyed Mosul's libraries in 2014, commentators immediately invoked the Mongol destruction of Baghdad. The parallel was obvious and intentional. Barbarians destroying knowledge they couldn't understand, repeating history's darkest chapters. The economic consequences were catastrophic and permanent. Iraq before 1258 was one of the wealthiest regions in the world. The irrigation systems that had been maintained and improved since ancient Sumerian times supported intensive agriculture. The Tigris and Euphrates Valley was a breadbasket. Trade routes connected it to China, India, East Africa, and Europe. Baghdad was a commercial hub as much as an intellectual one. The Mongols deliberately destroyed the irrigation infrastructure. Dams were broken. Canals were filled in. Fields were salinated by flooding. This wasn't accidental damage from war. It was systematic destruction, designed to prevent the region from recovering and challenging Mongol authority. And it worked. Iraq's agricultural productivity collapsed and would not return to pre-Mongol levels until the 20th century. 700 years of poverty and backwardness, traceable directly to 13 days in February 1258. The population collapse was even worse. Baghdad in 1257 had roughly 1 million people. By 1259, maybe a few thousand survived. The surrounding countryside was depopulated, villages abandoned. Farms left fallow. Within a generation, Iraq's population had fallen by perhaps 90%. This wasn't just death from the siege, it was death from starvation, from disease, from the breakdown of all social order. It was death from the destruction of the systems, irrigation, trade, administration, that allowed a large population to survive in a semi-arid environment. Compare this to other civilizational catastrophes. The fall of Rome in 476 AD was traumatic, but Roman knowledge survived in Byzantium and in monasteries across Europe. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population, but the knowledge infrastructure survived. Libraries remained. Universities continued. When the plague ended, Europe recovered relatively quickly because the institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge still existed. Baghdad had no such recovery. The institutions were destroyed. The scholars were dead. The books were ash and ink in the Tigris, and the political fragmentation that had prevented a unified defense against the Mongols only deepened after Baghdad fell. No one could. The resources, the expertise, the political will, all gone. Some historians argue the Mongol destruction was actually beneficial in the long run because it broke the Abbasid monopoly on Islamic authority and allowed new centers of power to emerge in Egypt and Turkey. That's a cold calculation. Tell that to the 250,000 corpses in Baghdad. Tell that to the scholars whose life's work was thrown into the Tigris. Tell that to the communities who watched their children executed for the crime of living in the wrong city at the wrong time. Others point out that Islamic civilization did recover. The Ottoman Empire would eventually control most of the former caliphate territories. Islamic scholarship continued in Cairo, Istanbul, Isfahan, Delhi. New libraries were built. New books were written. This is true. But it's also beside the point. Baghdad never recovered. Iraq never recovered. The intellectual momentum that had made the Islamic world the scientific and cultural leader of the medieval world was broken, and by the time it could rebuild, Europe was experiencing its renaissance, partly fueled by rediscovering the very texts that Muslim scholars had preserved and translated centuries earlier. There's a bitter irony there. European scholars studying Arabic translations of Greek philosophy in Toledo and Sicily were accessing knowledge that had been systematically destroyed in Baghdad. The Islamic Golden Age ended in blood and ink in the Tigris River, but its legacy survived in the margins of European manuscripts translated from Arabic centuries before the Mongols arrived. Here's what keeps me up at night about this story. The Mongols didn't need to destroy Baghdad. Hulagu could have accepted surrender before the siege. He could have looted the city and left it standing, the way Genghis Khan often did with cities that submitted early. The death toll could have been in the hundreds instead of the hundreds of thousands. The libraries could have been preserved. The scholars could have lived. But Hulagu chose total destruction. And he chose it because the Mongol imperial system required examples. Cities that resisted completely had to be annihilated completely, so that the next city would surrender immediately. It was a calculated trade. Destroy one city utterly to avoid having to fight for 10 cities later. From a purely military economic perspective, it was rational. From a human perspective, it was monstrous. And that's the lesson of Baghdad. 1258. Civilizations don't fall because they're weak or decadent, or morally inferior, the way triumphalist narratives like to claim. They fall because they face enemies who are willing to destroy them completely, while they hesitate, divide, and hope for rescue that never comes. The Mongols weren't more civilized than the Abbasids. They were just more ruthless. And in February 1258, Ruthlessness won. The Tigris River doesn't run black anymore. The ink washed away centuries ago. But the knowledge it carried is still gone. And every time a library burns, every time a scholar is silenced, every time a city is destroyed for making a political example, we're still living in the shadow of those 13 days in 1258, when the world's greatest city became a graveyard and the Islamic Golden Age bled out. In the streets of Baghdad, description. The Tigris River runs red with blood for 3 days, then turns black. Not from more blood from ink. Millions of books from the world's greatest library are being thrown into the water. This isn't fiction. This is Baghdad, February 12, 8. In 13 days, the Mongol army killed up to 1 million people and ended the Islamic Golden Age. This video explores the brutal reality of the Siege of Baghdad, the catastrophe that textbooks sanitize and Western narratives misrepresent.